All right, I think we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is Caitlin McNamara from the Board for People with Developmental Disabilities Living Well Project. I am joined this morning by Lisa Pugh from the ARC Wisconsin, and we're going to talk about National Caregiver Month and the Governor's Task Force on Caregiving and all kinds of stuff related to caregivers. So we're grateful that you've joined us, and I'll give Lisa a chance to introduce herself, and then we'll just have a conversation.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Lisa Pugh, as Caitlin said. Happy to join you this morning. I am the Executive Director of the ARC Wisconsin, which is a statewide disability advocacy organization that's been around for like 70 years. We advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. The ARC Wisconsin is one of like 600 chapters across the country. There's 14 chapters in Wisconsin, and those chapters were started by people with disabilities and family members, and they work on local issues for people with disabilities. But I think more importantly, the ARC is known for our state and national level advocacy on issues that are important to people with disabilities. So I spent a lot of time in Madison, working in the state capitol, some time in Washington, working on issues to help improve things for people with disabilities. So that's a little bit about me and the ARC. Oh, I forgot the most important thing. I'm also a family caregiver. I have an adult daughter. I have 3 children, but I have an adult daughter who has a developmental disability. She's 21 and she's out at her community job today. So she uses the IRIS program. And so we kind of are walking the talk here in terms of programs and supports for people with disabilities in our home lives.
Great. Like Lisa said, and like we mentioned, it's National Caregiver Month. So it's well-timed for this discussion. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly show you the Facebook event that we have up right now. It's got the governor's proclamation, and it's also got some more interesting information about things that are happening this month. So give me 1 second and I'll share my screen so everybody can see that. Here we go. All right, so this is the Facebook event. If you're on Facebook, you can go ahead and find this on the BPDD page or the Wisconsin Family Caregiver Support. And it has a giveaway. Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit more about what they're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ARC Wisconsin and BPDD have been working with the Wisconsin Family and Caregiver Support Alliance. The Alliance has been around for 3 years now, and it's a group of people and organizations who are concerned about family caregiver issues. And family caregivers, it's probably a good place to start to talk about who they are, but family caregivers could be people like me, parent of an adult child with developmental disabilities, somebody like Caitlin, who's sibling to somebody with disabilities and provides some care and support in the home. And there also are a lot of family caregivers for older adults. They can be a spouse, they can be a sister-in-law, they can be a mother, brother, there's a great variety of caregivers. And so November has traditionally been the time to celebrate the contributions of those caregivers in Wisconsin. So the Wisconsin Family Caregiver Support Alliance, it decided this month to kind of segment the weeks and have kind of different recognition of different types of caregivers every week during the month of November. So this first week is really a celebration and recognition of what we call kinship caregivers. And so there are approximately 7,000 children in Wisconsin who are being taken care of by other relatives other than their parents. And it's kind of a growing population of caregiving in Wisconsin. It's unfortunately can be related to the state's opioid crisis, where we have family members who are addicted and temporarily can no longer take care of their own children. So sometimes parents step in, sometimes brothers and sisters step in. So what you see on the screen here for this Facebook event is our week-long celebration of those kinship caregivers. And each week there will be a contest. So this is sponsored by the Wisconsin Family Caregiver Support Facebook page. So if you look for the Wisconsin Family Caregiver Support page, you will find the contest for every week. And there's different challenges during the day. It could be something simple of, sharing a story about your own caregiving experience or a picture that identifies with the question. And then the Respite Care Association of Wisconsin is offering prizes. So each week there will be I believe it's two $20 Amazon gift cards that will be randomly provided to people who participate in the Family Caregiver Celebration Challenge. So go in, find those events, virtual events, and sign up to attend, and then just check the posts and set your notifications so you're seeing them. And then you might win an Amazon gift card. So great way to learn more about caregiving in Wisconsin, participate in the celebration, and then maybe win a prize.
Awesome. I will definitely make sure that the link to this is both in the chat here on Zoom and on the Facebook live stream, as well as the Wisconsin Family Caregiver Support Program page, so that people can see other posts from the other weeks as they come up. Because like Lisa said, there's going to be more of these focused on different caregiver relationships throughout the month. So that is a really great opportunity. And you're right, it's a great segue to talking about what kinds of caregivers there are in Wisconsin. And there are lots of different kinds.
There are approximately almost 600,000 family caregivers in Wisconsin. So those are people that are providing, they provide about 80% of all the care to older adults, people with disabilities, and we're not even talking about people who are caring for minor children. So almost 600,000 people providing 80% of care, and that care really is valued at about, let's see, my notes say $6.9 million annually of unpaid care. That these are people, and caregiving can take many forms. It can be taking somebody to their doctor medical appointments. It can be helping them with grocery shopping. It can help them with bathing and dressing, but there's also a lot of caregivers that do really complex medical tasks that are often would be performed by a healthcare professional. So the range of caregiving tasks that are happening are really pretty great. And what we're seeing is considerable stress on those family caregivers. I mentioned the Wisconsin Family and Caregiver Support Alliance. Last year, we surveyed approximately 600 caregivers across Wisconsin. And what the results showed us is that, 3/4 of those family caregivers say that the caregiving is so great that they're really not able to meet their own needs. And a lot of those caregivers, 6 out of 10 are employed. So they have another paid job. And about 2/3 of those Wisconsin caregivers who are employed said they were really having difficulty balancing their caregiving responsibilities at home and then also their job. And so then what you see is that the data tells us that these are people who pass up on promotions. They might pull back to part-time. They might have to quit their jobs. And that happens pretty frequently. And then the end result is people who don't have enough of their own saving for retirement. They're not advancing in their careers, and they're just trying to balance, supporting their own families plus the person that they're providing care for. So that's a pretty significant issue in Wisconsin that we discovered in the survey. And 90% of those caregivers in that survey also told us that it was compromising their own physical or mental health. So caregiving can be very rewarding. We also heard that from caregivers, that it's something that they want to do, that they think it's important, that they get lots of value out of doing it, and they wouldn't choose to do anything else. But at the same time, it really is a pretty stressful job. So I think we're seeing particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, that's a lot of the stress on caregivers has exacerbated. I know Living Well has been tracking some of the concerns with COVID-19, and the impact on family caregivers is often because they might not be able to find paid direct care help because there's fewer workers out there willing and able to do the work, or they're getting sick, that family members then often have to do a lot more caregiving maybe than they were before. We're also seeing that loved ones with disabilities and even older adults maybe don't have the same outside activities and opportunities as they used to, whereas maybe before they used to go to some community day activities, they maybe had a job, they might have been going to community places with friends. Well, because of the pandemic, a lot of those activities aren't happening, or they're virtual or restricted in some way, to where that loved one is spending far more time at home with the caregiver. And I know this is something that we experienced early on in the pandemic when, before Erica left, Erica's my daughter, before she exited public school, when she turned 21 in June, school was completely virtual. And she's not someone who does well with virtual school. So she wasn't seeing friends anymore. She wasn't leaving the house anymore. She's home all the time with mom and dad and brother. And it was very frustrating for her, and also frustrating for us. So I think you're seeing a lot of that across the state and the country for that matter. And I think another trend that's related here is that we have about 65%, so about 2/3 of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are living with family members. And so they're living at home, very likely with mom and dad, and 25% of those family caregivers are over age 60, and a proportion of them are over age 80. So think about that. You're, getting up in your years, and you have some of the same aging and other health issues that all aging individuals have. And then you're still providing a lot of daily cares for an adult son or daughter. And it's a pretty significant issue that we really haven't found a solution for. And so it's something that the ARC Wisconsin has certainly been working on and focused on and trying to help families plan for. But I think we're going to be dealing with this, crisis into the future as well for family caregivers.
Yeah, and I think that there's this other emerging issue with COVID-19 and family caregivers, in that there's a lot of new skills that these caregivers are maybe having to take on. If they're socially isolated in their homes, and the caregivers who are normally in their lives aren't able to get there, or their supports have gone virtual into virtual services. Now it's about learning to operate technology you haven't had to before, or being not only the support for mealtime, but also all of their sort of social interactions as well. And so it's, we were talking earlier about the heavy burden that caregiving can have on mental health, but it's also it's this added layer of new skill building for caregivers at an age where that might not be something that they were prepared for. So it's just about making sure that caregivers can continue to feel the rewarding effects of caregiving, and that the loved one is in a safe environment where they have access to support, because the caregiver is now having to do so much more than they were before.
Absolutely. And I think it's also hard on family caregivers when they can't just be family, I can't just be mom. I can't just be sister or brother or sister-in-law, daughter-in-law. I have to be caregiver all the time. It's a much different role, and it strains the relationship with the person you're providing care for. And I think it just all of these issues speak to how we really need to find some solutions. And I know we also wanted to talk about this today, that about a year ago, Governor Evers established the Wisconsin caregiver task force, and there were Wisconsinites from all across the state who were appointed to the task force. Ultimately, there were 29. Hundreds of people applied because there's so much concern for this issue. Governor appointed 29 people. The executive director of BPDD, Beth Swedeen, was on the task force, as well as myself representing the ARC, and people from aging advocacy organizations like AARP, like the Greater Wisconsin Area Agency on Aging Resources, children's serving organizations, and lots of providers that offer respite and other services were on this task force. And we spent a year thinking about all of these barriers that we've just been discussing, looking at equity issues, who are caregivers and where are the pressure points in the system. And I think that's a whole nother conversation about how many family caregivers are people of color and how the experience of caregiving is different for people, and how often people of color are providing more hours of caregiving than white families, and doing more sort of burdensome tasks. And so there's lots of issues kind of wrapped up in there that we talked about as a task force. And we had experts from across the country talking about the workforce, talking about how can we get more paid people in the system? How can we create more respite care so that these family caregivers have relief? And then also, what are some of the things that would actually make a difference for family caregivers themselves? And so our task force broke into different groups. Of course, there were actual family caregivers and people who receive care as part of these groups as well, and came up with 16 proposals or recommendations that made their way to the governor's desk on September 30th. So we can spend a little time today talking about what's in that report, what's in those recommendations, and maybe for people that are listening to this, like what they might want to do to help support family caregivers. Did you want to share the report?
Yeah, let me go ahead and pull that up. And I think one of the themes that we're talking about here really is that it's the idea that these activities might not necessarily be burdensome with the right amount of support, with good caregiver training, with more economic stability for families who are taking on these roles. Like, the caregiving of itself is in and of itself is a very rewarding thing. It's an incredibly important job and role that these people are playing in their loved ones' lives, or in somebody that they are paid to support. But that isn't the burden. The burden is all the extra that we're not doing as a community to support these people and lift them up. And so I think the governor's task force is really trying to get at what we can do to make this the rewarding job that it should be.
Absolutely. We can't fix all problems, but we certainly tried to kind of pinpoint where the needs were and what does the evidence tell us the solutions could be. So if you want to stop there,
Yeah.
Caitlin, and I know if people want to read this report or check it out, I think if you wanted to Google Governor's Task Force on Caregiving, or I know that Caitlin's going to put it in the chat so you can look at it later, because I think it's a really good report and worth reading. But this executive summary kind of gives you the outline of what the basics of those proposals were. And the task force split into two groups. One group looking more specifically at family caregiving issues and solutions, and then another group that was looking at the direct care paid workforce. And I think we'll talk today a little bit more focusing on the family caregiving side of the proposals, which are the top 5 that are listed on the page that Caitlin has up. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these and kind of what the next steps are. So the family caregiver assessment is something that a lot of states do. There is an evidence-based assessment that actually when you ask family caregivers the right questions and help them to identify their stress level and needs, you can provide more targeted resources and supports to that person. And so in states that are using this particular tailored caregiver assessment and referral system, they call it T-Care, which actually was developed in Wisconsin, what they're finding is that they have more efficient use of caregiver resources, because I think what we know in Wisconsin is that not everybody knows where the resources and supports are. And typically it's the people that need them most that are not finding them or accessing them. So what a caregiver assessment does is asks kind of the right questions, and then triages supports to caregivers in the most need. And when I say in the most need, those might be caregivers that are seriously compromising their own health or ability to provide care, caregivers that are very close to placing their loved one in a more segregated facility outside of their home. So maybe a nursing home or some other place that's not as home-like, maybe where the person would not prefer to be. And so how can we help that family caregiver to continue providing the care that they have? And what this proposal says is that we're going to pilot this evidence-based tool. We're going to ask for a consortium or a group of organizations in a region of the state to work together to apply this family caregiver assessment, so that we can really test and show how we're meeting the needs of caregivers in a better way. So T-Care is something that I'm pretty excited about. I think can really make a difference for caregivers in Wisconsin, because we've seen it work in other states where they're actually showing that they're diverting people from going into nursing homes or other expensive types of institutional settings, and that families say that their stress is actually relieved because of the support, that this tailored support that's provided. So did you have a question about that, Caitlin?
No, I think it's just a really interesting, I think it speaks to a lot of even what Living Well does about saying, like, the first step is always to do some self-reflecting and self-assessing, because the problem can seem very overwhelming and very, individually it can seem overly burdensome, but really it's about narrowing down where the issue is, what kind of support you might need. And that's a hard thing to just do on your own, because with caregiving, from personal experience, everything kind of builds on, one thing to the next. And so really taking the time to evaluate where is the need the greatest is something that's really, it really speaks to, like, the way that you tackle problems.
Yeah, and one thing that we've found out about family caregivers, and this is probably no secret to the family caregivers that are listening, is that people often don't identify themselves as a family caregiver, and they don't recognize that, and they're less willing to kind of ask for help. And so this kind of gets to that issue, because you don't have to identify yourself as a family caregiver. It's asking you these questions and helping to do that for you. So, I think what you just said, Kaylin, too, like, we hope that these proposals that require some investment on the part of the state can have, broad support from policymakers, because it's addressing a need in Wisconsin, but it's also an efficient use of resources. We're going to target the resources that we have in a way that gets to the people in need. So similarly, the second proposal on your screen, the Aging and Disability Resource Center. So most people should be aware that they have an ADRC that serves wherever they live. However, the data that we have on ADRCs shows us that people don't generally call the ADRC unless they're in crisis. So, and they might not even be aware of the fact that they have caregiver support resources. Another issue with Wisconsin ADRCs is that the caregiver supports that they provide, there's very limited funding, and generally, they're only supporting caregivers of people over age 60. So caregivers who are providing support to that adult son or daughter with intellectual developmental disabilities in their 40s or 50s wouldn't be able to access a lot of these caregiver supports. Although right now with COVID-19, a lot of ADRCs are running like virtual family caregiver support groups that a lot of people find very helpful. So I would urge folks to check out what kinds of caregiver supports might be available at your ADRC now. But this proposal says we need to do a better job of letting people know that ADRCs have resources, information, and support for caregivers, and that we need to expand the offering of those supports. ADRCs are a very logical local resource for people to call because they are connected to local transportation options, local respite care options, grocery pickup. And that's another thing is that we try to do in the task force that is kind of embedded in this proposal is getting people thinking more broadly about what is respite, because during times of COVID, you might not want a strange respite care worker coming into your home to give you a break, even though you need a break. But there could be other ways that a caregiver could get some relief. Somebody who does pick up their groceries, who mows their lawn, who shovels their walk, fixes some things around the home, or is even just, engaged with that loved one with a disability virtually or in some other way so that the caregiver doesn't have that role all the time. So I really like this recommendation too, because I think it builds upon a structure of ADRCs in Wisconsin that a lot of people see as very successful.
Yeah, and I think it really does talk about that, looking locally, because the issues that family caregivers are going to run into is going to be incredibly dependent on where they live. Transportation is a huge issue for people in rural communities. We know it's a big issue all over the state, but it's in particular a very difficult one in rural communities. And so having a resource center that really is targeted to what is available and what is needed in your community is really going to help people have access and not be worried that these changes or these recommendations are more focused on things that are possible in Madison and Milwaukee and less possible in the rural counties. And so I think that's really an important way of looking at it too. And I also think you brought up a really good point about how family caregiving isn't necessarily always tied to the immediate needs of the person who is needing the support. Like, the family caregiver is going to need support to do things like mow the lawn or get the snow shoveled that has immediate benefit, not only for the person who's being supported, but for the family overall, that makes them more able to provide good support to the person who needs it. It's a broader scope than we sometimes think about, because it's a family. Like, in my own personal experience, we're a family of people who are supporting and who also need support, because everything that we don't have to do means that we can refocus our energy on things that are beneficial to the members of the family.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the next on the list of the family caregiver recommendations from the task force is something called the Family Medical Leave Act amendments, and people might be generally familiar with FMLA, Family Medical Leave. Wisconsin, like all states, has a state statute around family medical leave, but we think it needed to be modernized because there's a lot more diversity of people providing care than just moms and dads, and spouses, which generally is what's covered under FMLA. So this expansion of Wisconsin's current Family Medical Leave Act law wouldn't have a cost, but it would just say that siblings. So Caitlin, I know you're a sibling, and if you for some reason had to take time off of your job to support your sister, you wouldn't right now be covered under FMLA. But and the same is true for grandparents, who I mentioned before are doing a lot more care of grandkids these days, and or grandchildren who are providing care. So this in some ways is talking about modernizing how we think about family members who often are in those caregiving roles, and And one of the members of our Wisconsin Family and Caregiver Support Alliance is Wisconsibs. If you aren't familiar with Wisconsibs, it's a great organization that supports siblings of all ages of people with disabilities. And one issue that they certainly are very aware of is adult siblings of persons with intellectual developmental disabilities that often when mom or dad can't provide the care anymore, they are it. Like they are the sole caregiver. Sometimes that sibling moves in with them. And right now, that sibling care relationship would not be covered under Wisconsin law. So this expands that definition. It expands your ability to take leave to include chronic conditions for care, and then different ways that the care that your leave time could be qualified. So we know that family caregivers, it's not just, those daily, I'm helping you, to get dressed in the morning or to take a bath a couple times a week. I'm also going to planning meetings, maybe IEP meetings, and that takes a lot of time and coordination. And right now, a lot of these people are having difficulty, like I said, balancing their paid work and the need to take these other home responsibilities. So that would be a really great change in Wisconsin if we could move that forward. That's legislation. So each of these recommendations kind of has a different path. Some are things that we would hope either the Department of Health Services or Department of Workforce Development or some state agency maybe could start implementing now in some form. Some will need money, which generally means the legislature needs to allocate funds for it. And some really require a change in the law, which means this might start as a bill or a piece of legislation. So the timing on that is a little bit, our legislature is not in session. The governor right now is crafting a budget that he'll introduce early on in 2021. We hope some of these things might be in his budget. So there's different ways that each of these recommendations can move forward, but FMLA would definitely be a change in Wisconsin law. So the next one, the Credit for Caring Act, is another thing that the evidence tells us is really helpful to family caregivers, is that we know that the average family caregiver spends about $7,000 of their own money every year on things related to caring for their loved ones. So things that if their loved one doesn't qualify for a Medicaid program. So in Wisconsin, sometimes programs like Family Care or IRIS can pay for some things, like let's say you needed to modify your home to add, wheelchair ramp or things like that. Sometimes public programs can pay for those changes. But if your loved one isn't in a program, or if it's something that isn't covered, then people are paying for that out of pocket. So average annual cost for a family caregiver is about $7,000. And what we're seeing too is that if you're a long distance caregiver, so let's say I have a friend, Jane, and her mother lives in South Dakota, and she's trying to arrange and support her mom, paying out of pocket for somebody to come into the home to help her mom. That average cost for a long distance caregiver is $14,000 a year. So the Credit for Caring Act says we want to provide some financial relief because we know that family caregivers are foregoing their own savings, foregoing, their retirement funds, and paying these costs out of pocket. So this would be a tax credit for family caregivers that would qualify of no more than $1,000, and it would be for people who file as an individual that make less than $75,000 a year, or if you're a couple, $150,000 a year. So not everybody's going to qualify, and it's a maximum of $1,000, and it can only be credited towards certain things. But we really feel like this will at least provide some relief, financial relief to family caregivers. And again, this would be legislation. So this has to pass in our state legislature. So we'll be looking for champions for a bill for this.
Right. And maybe once we're done with going through this last one, we can talk a little bit about how people can get involved in helping, push for these recommendations and sharing
Absolutely.
what we talked about?
Yeah, the last one that's kind of in the family caregiver bucket, and I urge people to read through all of the recommendations because there's a lot here if you care about family caregiver issues. But the last one's called the CARE Act, and it's something that we worked really closely with AARP on. AARP has been a national leader in getting the CARE Act passed in states across the country. And it's based upon what we know about hospital discharge planning, that often these family caregivers who provide very complex medical tasks to somebody who's just leaving the hospital feel unprepared. So they might be handed written instructions. A nurse or some other medical professional might give them some oral, here's what you do, pass over the piece of paper, and the person is now your responsibility. These family caregivers say they're overwhelmed, they feel ill-equipped, and that they would like more support. So what this would do is require a live demonstration to the family caregiver of those medical tasks, so that it's more than just that piece of paper transfer with instructions. And what's happening in states where this is in place is, fewer readmissions, because the family caregiver feels equipped to provide the care, whether it's bandaging or wound care or surgical incision or medication management sorts of things. You can imagine how emotional and confusing it can be for a family caregiver when their loved one is coming home from the hospital in need of a lot of care. So this one, I think, just makes a lot of sense, and there's no cost to the state. There might be some pushback from the hospitals about this policy, but family caregivers have weighed in and said that this is something that would be extraordinarily helpful to them.
Especially when it's such a stressful time, if they've been in the hospital, there's probably a lack of sleep going all the way around, and there's just a need for a little bit more support in those instances that can help.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what can you do? Well, a couple of things. Would you want to move into the kind of the...
Yeah, I think that's great. I just want to encourage people. I will put the link in the chat on the Facebook page as well as in the Zoom. It's already there. It's a really great report. It's an easy to read report. They've done a really great job of putting it together. It goes, like Lisa said, it goes into a lot more recommendations beyond the family caregiving that we also think are super important. So do please take a look. And I think there's also, we'll make sure that if you have questions or you want more information, that we'll get contact information for you as well. So, but yeah, I think let's talk about how we can get people involved in moving these ideas forward.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about that, but then I want to make sure we wrap up with the celebration part and remind people about celebrating, because some of this can be really heavy. There's lots of problems and barriers for family caregivers, and we want to find solutions for them, and which is super important. So with regard to the report, the easiest thing that anybody can do is copy a link to that report and send it to your state legislators. I mean, it's super easy to email your legislators and find his or her email address. I know BPDD regularly shares the links to where you can find that. But I would say if family caregiving is an important issue to you, what I would do right after you end your, watching this video is write a message in an email and say, I am so-and-so, and I'm a family caregiver, and I care for whoever, or I'm a professional and I'm concerned about family caregivers in my work because, and I would really like to work with you to, on these recommendations. Can we talk about this? Or just to say, I wanted to make sure you were aware about this, and send the link to the report to both your state senator and your state representative in the assembly. Just put it on their radar. Tell your family caregiving story and make that elected official know that this is something that you're aware of and you're concerned about. And so I think that's number one, super easy thing to do. The second thing I think would be to spend some time just looking at the report and see if there's a recommendation in there that you feel pretty strongly about. Is there something that in your experience as a family caregiver or a professional who supports families, you're like, yeah, this would really make a difference? And I would then share that with people in your community, start talking about it, try to learn more, and try to understand the path for any one of those recommendations. A lot of times in the report, it will kind of tell you, is this something that requires money? Is this something that will require a change in state law? And then that gives you a sense of where you need to find your next steps on that particular recommendation. But like Caitlin said, I know you'll be sharing my contact information. If you feel passionately about wanting to work on one of these recommendations, I am more than happy to help. So just let me know, and I can kind of give you some guidance on what the next steps might be and who you maybe would contact to be helpful.
Yeah, we know how important personal stories are to building the narrative of why these things matter. All of this information is really, really great, but the thing that's going to resonate the most is hearing from families about their experience and why they think these things will be useful to them. So please feel willing to share your story if you are able to, because it's going to move the needle forward for everybody.
Yeah, and I think a story, it's not an opinion. I mean, it's your story, and nobody can challenge you on your own story. So that's what I tell people all the time. Don't be shy about telling your story, because that's one thing nobody can challenge you on. And you don't have to be right because it's your experience. So yeah, I would definitely say the more that the report is out there, put it on your social media, link it on your social media, say, hey, have you read this? If you have a local reporter who you think might be interested in doing a story on your family or on family caregiving, see if they want to do a story on the report and include your story. And I'm happy to help you with ideas like that. But back to the celebration part of November, the governor issued a proclamation. In fact, I have it right here. Hang on one second. He's issued a formal proclamation of November as Family Caregiving Month. So they give you a nice fancy parchment paper here. And he says, whereas Wisconsin's family caregivers and direct care workforce provide critical services that promote the well-being and enhance the quality of life for our state's most vulnerable populations, including children, people with disabilities, and older adults. They perform a variety of complex tasks, including bathing, dressing, medication management, coordinating services, providing financial assistance, and performing medical or nursing tasks. I know that BPDD has shared this on their Facebook page. It's on my website if you want to read the whole proclamation. But I think it's a nice recognition of family caregivers. And then, like we started out the Facebook Live with, if you go to the Wisconsin Family Caregiver Facebook page, you will learn all about the month's virtual celebration. And again, there are contests every week that you can enter in. Respite Care Association providing Amazon gift cards every week, random prize drawings if you participate in the contest. So the first week of recognition will be these Kinship Caregivers. So that's happening right now. That's the grandparents and other family members that are providing care in Wisconsin. Next week, we're recognizing employed caregivers. So those 6 and 10 caregivers we talked about, who are also, holding down an outside job while they're providing care. So we'll be sharing information on employed caregivers and the different concerns and questions about that population of caregivers. The third week, we'll be talking about caregiving across the lifespan. So we know there are teenagers that provide support and care to their siblings with disabilities, and then we have, like we were talking about, these elderly parents who are also continuing to be caregivers late into their lives. So we'll talk about that caregiving across the lifespan, and then the final week of November we'll talk about those long distance caregivers, and that along with kinship might be an area of caregiving that people really haven't thought a lot about, but there really are, with aging baby boomers, a lot of adult children who are trying to support mom and dad from afar. And what are all the different issues that come up with that, and strains and problems with coordination. So I think we'll all learn we'll all learn something new every week of the celebration, but make sure that you're sharing and celebrating the caregivers in your life. Please engage with the Facebook events and celebrate a caregiver during November.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that they are an incredibly important force, an economic asset, as well as a community asset across the state of Wisconsin. And we're so lucky that we have so many wonderful caregivers in the state of Wisconsin who are continuing to do really, really important work. And we just want to make sure that they're recognized for all that they are contributing to the lives of their loved ones, but to our communities overall as well.
Definitely.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us today. Join us next week. We're going to have another Living Well Wednesday. We're talking a lot this month about not only caregiving, but social isolation as we move into the winter months and the strain of COVID that still exists in the community. So look for notifications from us about what we'll talk about next week. And thank you again so much to Lisa from the ARC Wisconsin for joining us today to talk about family caregiving and the report from the task force. We really appreciate it. If you have questions, we'll make sure that you can get Lisa's contact information. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.